53 years ago, a 3-year-old boy vanished from the front yard of his home on a quiet summer morning in a small American town, disappearing in seconds without a sound and leaving behind a family whose lives would fracture around that single moment in time. The boy's name was Ethan Miller. The town was Riverton, Ohio, the kind of place where neighbors waved without thinking and kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. It was the early 1970s, an era when front doors were rarely locked and danger felt like something that happened somewhere else, to someone else. That illusion shattered on June 14, 1972. Ethan lived with his parents, Robert and Susan Miller, and his older sister, Lily, who was 6 years old that summer. Robert worked construction, steady and reliable. Susan split her time between raising the kids and helping at a local bakery. Their house sat near the edge of town, where pavement gave way to packed dirt roads and open fields. That morning began like hundreds before it. Robert was fixing a loose hinge on the back door. Susan stood at the stove flipping pancakes, the smell of butter filling the house. Lily sat on the front steps, drawing shapes in a notebook with a dull yellow pencil. Ethan ran through the yard, chasing his shadow, clutching a small plastic truck with one missing wheel. Nothing about the moment felt important. But in the days leading up to that morning, something had been quietly out of place. Several neighbors had noticed a pale green pickup truck moving slowly through the street at odd hours. It never stopped long, never parked, just rolled past, sometimes once, sometimes twice, as if the driver was looking for something. Or someone. No one thought much of it. In Riverton, trucks came and went all the time. Just after 9 o'clock, Susan turned away from the window to check the stove. Lily looked up from her drawing and noticed Ethan had wandered closer to the front gate than usual. He stood near the edge of the yard, just a few feet from the road. Then she heard a sound. Not loud, not alarming, something like a door closing or a vehicle slowing. Lily glanced toward the gate. For a brief second, she saw a man standing just beyond it. And then, Ethan was gone. At first, she thought he was hiding. She called his name once, then again. No answer. She ran into the yard, heart suddenly pounding, and saw the gate hanging slightly open. The road beyond it was empty, except for faint tire marks pressed into the dust. When Susan rushed outside, the quiet felt wrong. Too wide, too still. Robert dropped his tools and ran down the street, scanning alleys, yards, corners, expecting desperately to see his son wandering somewhere nearby. But there was nothing.
Within minutes, neighbors spilled into the road, calling Ethan's name, checking behind sheds, peering into empty lots. Someone looked down an old well. Someone else searched the tree line. The panic spread faster than words. At 9:18 a.m., Robert called the police and said the sentence that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "My little boy is gone. I think someone took him." The dispatcher didn't hesitate. A child under 5, missing less than 10 minutes, witnessed stranger, possible vehicle. Every alarm threshold was crossed at once. Patrol cars arrived within minutes, lights flashing against the quiet homes. Officers knelt in the dirt near the gate, photographing footprints and tire impressions before the wind could erase them. Others spoke gently to Lily, asking her to describe the man she saw. She could only remember pieces. Tall, close, gone too fast. A perimeter was thrown up around the neighborhood. Roads were blocked. Officers watched every vehicle that passed, searching for a pale green pickup among the traffic. But Riverton's streets were already swallowing the moment, dissolving it into normalcy. A canine unit arrived and placed Ethan's abandoned toy at the gate. The dog followed the scent straight across the road, then stopped, right where a vehicle would have been waiting. The trail didn't wander, it didn't scatter, it ended cleanly. Investigators marked the spot with tape and stood silently, staring at the empty road as if it might explain itself. Over the next several hours, Riverton became a grid of searching bodies. Officers swept fields, yards, drainage ditches. A helicopter circled overhead. Every possible escape route was mapped and analyzed. But no clothing was found, no toys, no trace of Ethan beyond that single point where the scent vanished. Witnesses came forward slowly, hesitantly. An elderly woman said she heard a truck slow near her window around the same time. A man watering his lawn saw something green pass the corner. Another neighbor, watching from an upstairs window, thought the truck had an enclosed back, not open like most pickups. Each detail felt close to something important, and yet never quite enough. By nightfall, the truth had settled heavily over Riverton. Ethan Miller was no longer in the neighborhood, and whoever had taken him had planned it. The investigation stretched into days, then weeks. The truck was never identified. No license plate, no clear description of the driver, no record tying any vehicle in town to the tire tracks left in front of the Miller home. Eventually, the searches slowed. The road returned to dust. Life, for everyone except the Millers, moved forward. But Lily never forgot what she saw. She carried the memory into adulthood, the open gate, the stranger's silhouette, the silence where her brother should have been. And she held on to one belief, quietly, stubbornly, against all odds, that Ethan was still alive somewhere, waiting.
The days after Ethan Miller vanished blurred together in a haze of sirens, strangers, and unanswered questions. Riverton had never seen anything like it. Reporters arrived from nearby cities, their cameras pointed at the Miller home, the front gate now wrapped in yellow tape. Susan sat at the kitchen table answering the same questions over and over, her voice growing softer each time. What was he wearing? Did he wander? Had there been problems at home? Robert stood in the yard, staring at the dirt road as if he could force it to give something back. Police worked the case hard in the beginning. They had to. A child taken in broad daylight from his own yard meant the town itself was wounded. Officers followed every lead, no matter how thin. They checked registered truck owners, they questioned drifters passing through, they interviewed men who worked construction, delivery routes, farm supply runs, anyone who might drive a green pickup. Nothing stuck. The physical evidence told a clean, ruthless story. Whoever took Ethan knew exactly how long they had. They didn't hesitate, they didn't fumble, they didn't linger. That frightened the investigators more than chaos ever could. The working theory solidified quickly. A stranger, someone who had watched, someone who had waited. In the weeks after the abduction, more neighbors came forward, suddenly remembering things that hadn't seemed important at the time. A green truck idling longer than necessary, the same vehicle passing the block twice in one morning. A man leaning on a steering wheel, eyes fixed on the yard. Too late. Composite sketches were drawn based on fragments of memory. None led anywhere. The sketches hung on bulletin boards and grocery store windows, slowly curling at the edges. As the investigation stalled, the Millers' lives collapsed inward. Susan stopped baking, stopped sleeping. She would wake up at night convinced she heard Ethan crying, her heart racing as she ran room to room, only to find silence.
Robert threw himself into work, coming home exhausted and hollow. He built shelves, fences, anything that required his hands to move so his thoughts wouldn't. Lily watched it all. She grew quiet, carrying a weight far heavier than a 6-year-old should. In her mind, she replayed the moment again and again, wondering if she could have screamed faster, run sooner, done anything differently. Years passed. Birthdays came and went without candles. Christmas mornings left an empty space beneath the tree. Ethan's room stayed untouched longer than anyone admitted was healthy. By the late 1970s, the case was officially labeled cold. The word felt cruel. Cold meant unanswered. Cold meant forgotten. But somewhere beyond Riverton, Ethan was still alive. He just didn't know it. In late 1973, a woman named Helen Parker walked into a county office in Wichita, Kansas, carrying a toddler on her hip. She was in her early 40s, recently divorced, her life pared down to essentials. She filled out paperwork slowly, carefully, registering a delayed birth certificate for a boy she called Daniel Parker. She told the clerk he'd been born outside a hospital. That happens sometimes. No one questioned it. Daniel grew up believing Helen was his mother. She fed him, clothed him, tucked him in at night, but there were things missing that he couldn't name when he was young. No baby pictures, no stories about the day he was born, no relatives. Whenever he asked, Helen changed the subject, said it didn't matter, said families were built, not explained. Daniel learned not to push. At school, he was quiet, polite. He didn't cause trouble. Teachers described him as observant, withdrawn, older than his years. He struggled sometimes with feelings he couldn't explain, an unease, a sense of not fully belonging anywhere. Paperwork followed him like a shadow. Vaccination records started late. His birth certificate looked different from his classmates. His social security number was issued years after most kids got theirs. Every time someone noticed, Helen smoothed it over. Hospitals close, records get lost. That's just how things were back then. And for a long time, that explanation worked. Robert threw himself into work, coming home exhausted and hollow. He built shelves, fences, anything that required his hands to move so his thoughts wouldn't. Lily watched it all. She grew quiet, carrying a weight far heavier than a 6-year-old should. In her mind, she replayed the moment again and again, wondering if she could have screamed faster, run sooner, done anything differently. Years passed. Birthdays came and went without candles. Christmas mornings left an empty space beneath the tree. Ethan's room stayed untouched longer than anyone admitted was healthy. By the late 1970s, the case was officially labeled cold. The word felt cruel. Cold meant unanswered. Cold meant forgotten. But somewhere beyond Riverton, Ethan was still alive. He just didn't know it. In late 1973, a woman named Helen Parker walked into a county office in Wichita, Kansas, carrying a toddler on her hip. She was in her early 40s, recently divorced, her life pared down to essentials. She filled out paperwork slowly, carefully, registering a delayed birth certificate for a boy she called Daniel Parker. She told the clerk he'd been born outside a hospital. That happens sometimes. No one questioned it. Daniel grew up believing Helen was his mother. She fed him, clothed him, tucked him in at night, but there were things missing that he couldn't name when he was young. No baby pictures, no stories about the day he was born, no relatives. Whenever he asked, Helen changed the subject, said it didn't matter, said families were built, not explained. Daniel learned not to push. At school, he was quiet, polite. He didn't cause trouble. Teachers described him as observant, withdrawn, older than his years. He struggled sometimes with feelings he couldn't explain, an unease, a sense of not fully belonging anywhere. Paperwork followed him like a shadow. Vaccination records started late. His birth certificate looked different from his classmates. His social security number was issued years after most kids got theirs. Every time someone noticed, Helen smoothed it over. Hospitals close, records get lost. That's just how things were back then. And for a long time, that explanation worked. Meanwhile, in Riverton, Lily Miller grew up and moved on the only way she knew how, by carrying the past quietly. She married, had children of her own, and tried to give them the kind of watchful love she wished she'd had the chance to protect Ethan with. But she never stopped wondering, never stopped imagining a boy with her brother's eyes somewhere out there, living a life that should have been theirs together. In the 1990s, when DNA technology first began to surface in missing persons cases, Lily submitted a sample. It felt like tossing a message into the ocean. She didn't expect an answer. Years went by. Daniel Parker became an adult, then a man. He worked factory jobs, paid his bills, stayed under the radar. He was good at blending in, at not drawing attention to himself. But the older he got, the harder it became to ignore the holes in his story. When he applied for a vocational loan, he was asked for documents Helen couldn't provide. When he tried to replace a lost ID, clerks frowned at inconsistencies. And when he asked Helen directly, really asked, her answers unraveled. Kansas, a clinic that never existed, a hospital that had closed before he was supposedly born. For the first time, Daniel felt fear, not of what he might find, but of how much he didn't know. After Helen passed away, taking her secrets with her, the silence became unbearable. In 2011, Daniel made a decision that would change everything. He ordered a consumer DNA test, not because he was looking for family, but because he needed proof that he existed. When the results came back, most of the matches were distant, names he didn't recognize, connections that meant nothing, until one alert stood out. Close family match detected. The surname attached to it was Miller. In Riverton, Ohio, Lily Miller received an email she nearly deleted, thinking it was spam. Then she read the words again. DNA match. Close relation. Her hands started to shake, because deep down, she already knew. And somewhere in Kansas, Daniel Parker stared at his screen, heart pounding, realizing that the truth he'd been circling his entire life was finally circling him back. When Detective Laura Bennett first reopened the Miller file in early 2011, she did not expect it to lead anywhere. Cold cases rarely did. Most were exercises in patience and restraint, boxes of aging paper, grainy photographs, names that led nowhere. Ethan Miller's case had all the familiar markers: a fast abduction, minimal physical evidence, a suspect vehicle too common to trace, and decades of silence. But Laura noticed something immediately. The case wasn't messy, it was precise. The original investigators had documented everything: timestamps, distances, scent loss points, witness positions. The abductor hadn't made a mistake, and that made Laura uneasy. Crimes like that usually belong to people who did not stop after one success. Her team digitized every scrap of the file. Handwritten notes became searchable text, old photographs were enhanced, maps were rebuilt with modern software, allowing them to visualize the green pickup's movement across Riverton in the days before Ethan disappeared. Patterns emerged. The truck hadn't wandered randomly. It had looped, always appearing between 8:45 and 9:15 in the morning, always passing the Miller home from slightly different angles, always leaving without stopping anywhere else. Someone had been watching. Laura ran the witness statements through a text analysis program, searching for details that had been too subtle to stand out in the 1970s. That's when she found it. Two witnesses, previously considered unreliable, had described something unusual: silver streaks in the green paint of the truck. At the time, it was dismissed as glare, poor memory, imagination. But Laura knew better. Certain Ford models produced in the late 1960s were notorious for paint degradation. Under sunlight, the green topcoat wore thin, exposing a metallic underlayer that looked like streaking. It narrowed the field from dozens of trucks to 3 possible models. For the first time in 40 years, the suspect vehicle had a shape. Then, the email arrived. Subject line: potential DNA match, missing child case. Laura opened it twice, just to be sure. The message referenced a consumer genealogy database alert. A man in Kansas had uploaded DNA that matched closely with 2 individuals carrying the Miller surname, one of whom had registered as a relative of missing child Ethan Miller. Laura's pulse quickened. She requested the anonymized data immediately. Male, early 40s, Kansas resident.
exactly the age Ethan would be. Coincidence was unlikely. Laura contacted Lily Miller first. Lily answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. Laura introduced herself and explained why she was calling. She kept her tone careful, professional, but when she mentioned a possible DNA match, Lily's composure cracked. "Are you saying he might be alive?" Laura didn't promise anything, but she didn't deny it either. 3 days later, Laura sat in a sterile lab room, a technician swabbing the inside of her cheek. She stared at the wall the entire time, afraid that hope itself might somehow ruin the process. Meanwhile, Laura requested the identity behind the DNA sample. His name was Daniel Parker. When Laura contacted him, he didn't hesitate. He'd been waiting for the call his entire life. Daniel gave his sample at a federal lab in Wichita. The process went far beyond consumer testing. Autosomal markers, sibling probability modeling, kinship verification across multiple datasets. 2 independent labs ran the analysis. Laura didn't sleep while waiting. When the first report came in, she read it 3 times. Probability of full sibling relationship, 99.98%.
It wasn't enough. It had to be absolute. The second report arrived days later. 99.99% probability. Full siblings. There was no longer room for doubt. Daniel Parker was Ethan Miller. The boy taken from a front yard in Riverton, Ohio, had grown up less than 700 miles away under a different name, unaware that his family had been searching for him for nearly 4 decades. Laura sat back in her chair and let the weight of it settle. Cases like this didn't end. They transformed. She arranged 2 meetings, one in Riverton, one in Wichita. Lily was told first. She cried so hard she had to sit down on the floor. For years, she had imagined this moment in fragments: hospital beds, tragic confirmations, remains found in distant fields. She had never let herself imagine this. Her brother was alive. Daniel was told next. Laura met him in person, sitting across from him in a quiet interview room. She explained everything, slowly, carefully, watching his face change with each sentence. "You were taken," she said gently, "from your home when you were 3. Daniel's hands trembled. He didn't remember Riverton, didn't remember Lily, but something inside him shifted, like a lock turning. His entire life suddenly made sense. The missing pieces weren't flaws, they were stolen. The final step was confronting the past. Helen Parker had been dead for years, but Laura tracked down her records, her movements, her financial history. There were no adoption papers, no legal transfers, nothing that explained how Ethan had come into her care. But there was one thing. In 1973, Helen had worked at a roadside diner off a state highway. Truckers passed through constantly. Laura believed Ethan's abductor had handed him off, not abandoned him, given him away. A calculated decision, one that erased the trail forever. Now, 40 years later, that trail had resurfaced, and it was time for the past to face the present. The first meeting was arranged quietly. No cameras, no reporters, no announcements. Just a small conference room inside the Riverton Police Department, a place that still smelled faintly of paper and old coffee. Detective Laura Bennett wanted control, not for the department, but for the 2 people whose lives were about to collide. Lily Miller arrived early. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the door. In her mind, her brother was still 3 years old. Small hands, wide eyes, the way he used to follow her everywhere. She didn't know how to picture the man he had become. When the door opened, she stood before she realized she was moving. Daniel Parker stepped inside. He stopped just as abruptly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lily saw it. The eyes.
The same shape, the same quiet intensity. The thing she'd seen in the mirror her entire life, passed down from their father. Her knees buckled, and Daniel crossed the room without thinking, catching her as she cried. They didn't say hello. They didn't need to. For Daniel, the rush was overwhelming. Memories he didn't have flooded him anyway. Feelings rather than images. Safety, familiarity, a sense of something lost finally clicking back into place. They sat together for hours.
Lily told him about the morning he vanished, about the gate, about the man, about the years that followed. Daniel listened in silence, gripping a cup of water so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every detail landed like a physical blow. He asked questions quietly, carefully, afraid that if he pushed too hard, the truth might disappear again. "What about our parents?" he finally asked. Lily swallowed. "They never stopped looking," she said. "Not for a second." Daniel closed his eyes. The guilt came fast and unexpected, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he had lived, had birthdays, had choices, had a life, while his family had been frozen in the moment he vanished. Detective Bennett watched from the corner of the room, giving them space, but her work was far from done, because finding Ethan was only part of the story. The next question was how. Records showed that Helen Parker had never legally adopted Daniel. There was no paper trail connecting her to him, but her timeline overlapped almost perfectly with Ethan's disappearance. When Laura reviewed Helen's employment history, one detail stood out. In early 1973, Helen worked at a diner near a truck stop just off Interstate 35. Laura arranged interviews with former co-workers. Most remembered Helen vaguely, quiet, polite, kept to herself. But one remembered something else, a man. He'd come in a few times with a little boy. The child barely spoke, clung to the man's jacket, looked scared. The man paid in cash, never stayed long, and one day the boy came back with Helen instead. The man never returned. Laura believed she finally understood the final piece. Ethan's abductor hadn't wanted attention, hadn't wanted police, hadn't wanted a body. He wanted the child gone. Passing Ethan to Helen erased the risk. No missing child report in Kansas, no adoption records, just a new name and a quiet life. It was cruel and effective, but decades later, technology had undone it. When Daniel learned this, his emotions twisted into something darker. "I was sold," he said quietly. Laura chose her words carefully. "You were taken," she said, "and then hidden." The suspect, the man in the green truck, was never identified. Records from the 1970s were too thin. Witnesses were gone. Time had protected him. That reality was hard for everyone to accept. For Lily, it meant no arrest, no face to blame. For Daniel, it meant living with a truth that had no ending. But the story wasn't finished yet. The reunion didn't end with one meeting. Daniel traveled back to Riverton again and again. He stood in front of the house where he'd lived as a toddler, walked the street where he'd vanished, touched the gate that had once been left slightly open. Something stirred inside him there, a deep, unsettling familiarity. He began therapy, trying to reconcile two lives that had never known each other. Ethan, Daniel, one lost, one lived. Lily introduced him to extended family, cousins, nieces, people who had grown up hearing his name spoken softly, always with a question mark at the end. Every smile was bittersweet, because joy didn't erase loss, it coexisted with it. As the case closed officially, Detective Bennett filed her final report. Case status: resolved. Victim located alive. But she added a note few would ever read. Time does not heal all wounds. Sometimes it simply waits for the truth to catch up. For Daniel, the hardest part wasn't learning who he was. It was deciding who he wanted to be next. In the months after the reunion, reality settled in more slowly than anyone expected.
There was no moment where everything suddenly felt whole. Instead, Daniel lived in a constant state of adjustment, like walking through a house where the furniture kept shifting when he wasn't looking. Every conversation, every memory, every quiet moment carried the weight of two lives overlapping imperfectly. He began using his birth name again, carefully at first, Ethan. It felt foreign on his tongue, like trying on a coat that once fit but had been outgrown in strange ways. When Lily said it, though, something deep inside him responded immediately, without hesitation. They spent hours talking about childhood, about what he missed, about what she lost. Lily told him about their father, Robert, how he never forgave himself for not being in the front yard that morning, how he worked until his body gave out, as if exhaustion might dull the pain, how he died believing his son was gone forever. Ethan listened quietly. There was no anger, just grief, heavy and complicated. He learned about their mother, Susan, who passed years earlier after a long illness. Lily admitted that even at the end, Susan still whispered Ethan's name, as if calling him home might somehow work after all this time. That knowledge broke something open inside him. He had been loved, desperately, relentlessly, even in absence. At night, Ethan dreamed of places he couldn't quite remember. Sunlit yards, the sound of wind through open fields, the echo of a woman calling his name. He woke up shaken, heart racing, unsure whether the dreams were memories resurfacing or his mind trying to fill in gaps that could never fully close. Therapy helped, but it didn't provide answers. Only language. Language for the grief of a stolen childhood, for the guilt of surviving when everyone expected him not to, for the strange loyalty he still felt toward Helen, the woman who raised him, who may not have been innocent, but who had given him food, shelter, and something resembling love.
When people asked if he hated her, he didn't know how to respond. "I don't think she saved me," he finally said once, "but I don't think she wanted me dead either." That gray space haunted him. Investigators confirmed Helen had never been charged with a crime. By the time the truth emerged, she was gone, immune to accountability. The man who had taken Ethan, whoever he was, had vanished into history, protected by time and anonymity. There would be no trial, no confession, no justice in the traditional sense. Public interest surged briefly. Headlines ran stories about the boy found alive after 40 years. Talk shows requested interviews. Documentaries circled. Ethan declined most of them. He didn't want his life reduced to a miracle narrative or a crime statistic. He wanted to understand himself before explaining anything to the world. Lily respected that. So did Detective Bennett, who checked in occasionally, less as an investigator and more as someone who had walked alongside this story long enough to feel responsible for its landing. One afternoon, Ethan returned alone to Riverton. He stood across the street from the old house, now occupied by strangers who had no idea what had happened there. He didn't approach, didn't need to. The gate was different, the road was paved now, the dust that once held the last trace of him was long gone. But he closed his eyes and imagined the boy he had been, small, curious, unaware. For the first time, he felt compassion for that child, not pity, understanding. Later that evening, he and Lily sat on her porch, watching the sun dip low over the horizon. "You don't owe anyone anything," Lily said quietly. "Not a version of yourself, not forgiveness, not closure." Ethan nodded. But he knew one thing. He owed himself the truth. And with that truth came choice. He chose to keep both names, Ethan Miller, Daniel Parker. One belonged to his past. One had carried him through the world. Neither would be erased. The case officially closed a year later, filed away with a final notation that few cases ever receive.
recovered alive. For law enforcement, it was a rare victory. For the Miller family, it was a miracle tempered by grief. For Ethan, it was the beginning of something far more difficult than survival: integration.
In the end, there was no single moment that felt like closure. There was no finish line, no clean emotional landing where everything suddenly made sense. What Ethan discovered instead was something quieter and more honest. Closure, he learned, was not an event, it was a process. Months after the case was formally closed, Ethan stood in a small cemetery outside Riverton with Lily at his side. The air was cool, the sky overcast. 2 headstones rested beneath an old oak tree, Robert Miller and Susan Miller, side by side. He had rehearsed this moment in his head dozens of times. What would he say? How do you speak to parents who searched for you longer than you even knew you were missing? He knelt slowly and placed his hand on the stone. The marble was cold. "I'm here," he said aloud, his voice barely steady. "I'm sorry it took so long." Lily turned away, giving him privacy, though tears slid freely down her face. Ethan talked quietly for several minutes about the life he lived, about the man he became, about the questions that still didn't have answers. He didn't ask for forgiveness, he didn't need it, but he thanked them for loving him without knowing where he was, for believing he might still exist. When he stood, something inside him finally eased, not healed, not resolved, but acknowledged. That was enough.
In the years that followed, Ethan built a life on his own terms. He stayed in Kansas, but Riverton was no longer a ghost town in his mind. It was a place he could visit without fear, a place that held loss, yes, but also truth. He kept in touch with Lily weekly. Sometimes they talked about the past, sometimes they talked about nothing at all. The ordinary conversations mattered most. The investigation itself faded into records and archives. Detective Bennett moved on to other cases, but Ethan's file stayed with her longer than most. Not because of the crime, but because of the outcome. Cases like this were reminders that time could bury the truth, but it couldn't erase it. Years later, when asked what he believed really saved him, Ethan didn't mention DNA or technology. He mentioned memory. A sister who never let go, a family who refused to stop hoping, and one decision to question a story that never quite made sense. Somewhere out there, the man in the green truck remained unknown. He was never caught, never named, his role reduced to a shadow in the background of a story that ultimately refused to stay buried. And perhaps that was the final injustice. Or perhaps it was the reminder that even when evil escapes punishment, it does not get the last word. Ethan Miller's life was no longer defined by what was taken from him, but by what was found. A name, a family, a truth that waited 53 years to be spoken out loud. And on quiet mornings, when the world felt still, he sometimes thought about the front yard where everything changed. Not with fear, but with gratitude, because against every odd, he had come home.